Hello and welcome to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Nick Erickson, your host for this webinar. Back in 2017, during my first year at Instron, we hosted a webinar called 20 Ways to Test a Syringe. It was a hit, and today we're taking it a step further. We've added 5 new methods, bringing us to today's session, 25 ways to test a syringe. If you happen to attend the original session, you're probably saying to yourself, wow, this guy hasn't aged a day, and I thank you for that. But more importantly, we've made some exciting developments within our biomedical team, and they're here with us today. First up, you'll hear from Landon Goldfarb, Instron's biomedical market manager. Landon has become our go-to expert for medical and pharmaceutical testing. He's helped countless customers optimize their testing operations and played a key role in developing our latest testing systems for auto-injector devices, ISO 80369 and 11040. On a personal note, Landon has shared with me that he's not really a cake person, but he does appreciate a good blueberry pie. Joining Landon is Meredith Bernstein, our biomedical product specialist. Meredith brings a wealth of experience from her time on our applications team, where she helped tailor product solutions to meet unique customer needs. Now she's in a role dedicated to supporting our biomedical customers around the globe. When she's not at Instron, she's likely competing in an ultimate frisbee match. We've also got a lot of syringe testing methods to pack into an hour. So if it's anything like our morning session, we'll probably use most of that hour for the presentation. However, if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them into the Q&A panel, and we'll do our best to address those at the end or via email afterwards. And then just a quick note, this webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and it will also be available on our website at instron.com. So with that, let's dive in. I'll hand things over to Landon to kick things off.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you all for being here today. I'm very excited to walk through not all, but 25 unique ways to test a syringe. Similar to Nick, I started around the same time that we did the original webinar, and actually looking back at it and seeing how much we've learned since then, and how much we've developed to kind of better support customers in this space is pretty impressive. Because I would say just the wealth of knowledge that we've learned just in the last 5-10 years has been nothing short of amazing. And working with lots of customers, many of them who are on the call, trying to really understand this industry and kind of build up Instron's foundational knowledge of syringe testing and everything related to it. So we can go to the next slide. So really today, what we're going to try and do is, I'm going to start off with kind of the opening and trying to make sure we have a shared vocabulary around what is a syringe, what are the different components of the syringe, then talk to a little bit, we often have customers say, so like, hey, I need to do syringe testing. What do I need to do? And trying to really get the point across that can be an extremely loaded question, and really trying to pinpoint what is the right testing that needs to be done, which standards are most applicable, is something that, over time we've learned a lot about, and we have much better guidance today than we did in the past of what standards are most applicable for what types of customers. And then more importantly, and what Meredith is really going to go into, is for those tests, for each of those applications, what have we learned over the years, and what are the best practices for doing this? What are the challenges? And she'll kind of work through each one. So normally at the top of a webinar like this, we would have a slide saying, how the market for prefilled syringes is growing exponentially year over year. Patients want self-administration. There's biologics that are more sensitive drugs that require different requirements for these devices. Everyone on this call has a job because of this fact. Because we have to fit in so many standards, we're going to jump right in. But I'm sure we can all appreciate how fast this market is growing and how important it is to drug delivery for new types of drug molecules that are hitting the market. So let's really jump into it. So, talking about the anatomy of syringe, kind of first layer we'll talk about is really the material of the barrel itself. This is a pretty fundamental difference between different types of syringes. And one that I would say used to be very clear cut. You really, in most cases, either had plastic or glass syringes. And now there are newer materials coming to the market that in certain cases have properties that are more similar to glass, and in certain cases have properties that are more similar to plastics. They could be multi-layer plastics. They could be plastics with a glass coating on the interior. It's really all about trying to maximize the performance of the device while minimizing all of the impacts of the device itself on the formulation. So ensuring biocompatibility is optimized, ensuring that extractables and leachables are minimized. So there's a lot of work happening in this field looking at different types of materials. So, starting from the front of the syringe, needle attachment is a big differentiator between different types of syringe. So when you think about glass syringes, you typically are always looking at a staked needle, where the needle is press fit and actually embedded into the Luer cone itself. Um, for glass syringes, you also can have press fit Luer collars. So in terms of the Luer connection, there's essentially two different variations. You have a Luer lock type, which has threads, and then you have a Luer slip, which essentially just uses a 6-degree taper and kind of the friction to maintain connection. These are typically going to be used in conjunction with some sort of needle hub that gets attached at the time of use. In practice, most syringes that are out on the market are using a Luer lock because it does provide a much more secure connection between the syringe and the needle. When we talk about the closure, that's really going to be in line with the needle attachment. So again, so if you think about a stake needle, that is typically, if not always the case, where you'll have a rigid needle shield or an RNS. So this is a component that has a plastic outer housing and then an internal elastomeric piece that the tip of the needle will actually embed itself into to maintain a sterile barrier. For Luer connections, you'll have a tip cap, which similarly has an elastomeric component and a rigid plastic component to kind of maximize that ability to maintain a sterile barrier and have something that is easy for a patient or a healthcare provider to use in daily practice. And then lastly, we'll talk about different safety mechanisms. Um, Personally, I find these somewhat counterintuitive, but really the two main types of safety mechanism are going to be an active safety mechanism, which essentially means that it requires active user input to hide the needle from the user. So that could be something like on the screen where you have to essentially close a plastic cover over the needle. It could be simply replacing the RNS back onto the device. So there's a lot of different types of designs that exist for active safety mechanisms, but they all serve as preventing needle stick injuries. And then you have passive safety mechanisms. So these are mechanisms that automatically engage once the injection is complete. These will typically utilize some sort of spring-based mechanism. They're very similar to what you'd see in an auto-injector, where once the injection has finished, there's an automatic retraction of the needle to ensure that there's no direct access for the patient. And as you can imagine, this is an additional mode of failure. There's different tests that have to be done to evaluate passive safety mechanisms, and we'll talk about those today as well. So when we think about syringes, I think there's a lot of different functional groups that are being evaluated. So, and sometimes they're somewhat siloed depending on the team. So you could have somebody who's really focused on container closure integrity of the syringe. So they're thinking about the elastomer material choice, the elastomeric performance of the stopper, of the RNS. They're thinking about the storage conditions of that syringe. Is it going to be held in refrigerated conditions, ultra cold storage? What does that mean to the elastomeric components? things like geometric tolerances of the individual components. All of these things play a hand in ensuring container closure integrity. So, that's on one hand, I kind of think of it as ensuring that you're keeping everything outside away from the drug formulation. And then on the other hand, you have drug product stability, which is how do I prevent everything that's already inside from affecting the drug formulation? So here you're thinking about things like the barrel siliconization. You're thinking about the material of choice for your syringe, the extractables and leachables. What is the permeability to um, different things like oxygen, CO2, water vapor, all of things that can potentially affect certain types of drug formulations. And I think sometimes, it's easy to think of these as kind of isolated groups of variables, but ultimately they all do play into the functional performance of the device. When you think about at the end, mechanical testing can give you a really good insight into some of these other variables. So if you think about something like barrel siliconization, um, break loose glide testing can be a really good way to assess the quality of the siliconization within the barrel of a syringe. You're obviously all of your material choices are going to have a major impact on your mechanical testing. You think about storage conditions, so you might want to evaluate any change in break loose and glide force between a syringe that is conditioned under standard lab environment and a syringe that's conditioned in ultra low storage temperatures to really see if there is any change in the force profile from any geometric change of the elastomeric components. So all this to really show that there is a significant amount of complexity with syringes. Again, going back to the point that just saying, I need to do syringe testing, there's a lot that goes into it, and all of these variables do have a role to play in the ultimate performance of the device. And we'll kind of talk to you in each of the standards how some of those connections are made. And then lastly, kind of the last big question that we get is, well, how do I understand where do I fit in this web of standards that we would love to unravel, but at the end of the day, there are a lot of nuances to which standards make the most sense for what types of customers. So I think the few ways you can think about it is firstly, I think thinking from a component level, what part of the syringe am I actually interested in? That helps refine your decision which standards make the most sense. Then you could look at the big other one that I think is really important is where do I exist within the drug delivery supply chain? And within that, there's kind of two main buckets. So you kind of have those who are what I would say are drug agnostic. They're not concerned about what is ultimately put into the device. And then you have those who are thinking of it as a completed device, as a combination product with a drug. And answering that question can do a really good job of helping clarify which standards are more suitable than others. And then even within kind of you have that subcategory, you could even break it down more. So, thinking about component manufacturers, thinking about device manufacturers, thinking about pharmaceutical organizations, and thinking about contract organizations, they might each have a slightly different lens they're looking through, and they might have slightly different results that they're looking to evaluate. And even this, really is an oversimplification because even within device manufacturer, we could be talking about, is this a primary package, a syringe manufacturer? Is it a secondary package? Is it an auto-injector manufacturer? Within pharmaceutical organizations, you can run kind of the whole gamut from early platform development teams to commercialization and production teams who are doing very different things and have different requirements. So it's really important to understand kind of where you exist and what is most important to you from an evaluation standpoint. Um, and as we go through this, you'll kind of see there is this very intricate connection between all of these different standards. Even just looking at all the cross references, it's clear that they all of the standards are related to each other in one way or another. So I think obviously the USP is kind of more foundational, looking at the individual elastomeric closures, but a lot of those tests are derived from the ISO standards. Obviously, the FDA draft guidance on EDDOs are very much looking at the final combination product, but again, pulls in references from ISO standards. So at the end of the day, they are very much connected. But hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a very good idea of where should I be starting? What should I be looking for? So with that, I will hand it over to Meredith, who will begin the long walk through the 25 ways to test a syringe.
Thanks, Landon. All right. So now we're really going to get into the specifics of each of the test methods that we recommend and typically see to evaluate kind of each of the components that Landon just went through. Obviously, we have, another 45 minutes or so. 25 test methods is quite a lot, and each one on its own could probably be an entire webinar. So we're certainly assuming that all of you with us today have some familiarity with these test standards. And this is really going to be a high-level overview intended to give you some of the insights that, we've learned from our experience with this testing. But as we go, if there is something that you think could be a really good topic for a more, in-depth deep dive sometime in the future, certainly let us know kind of in your feedback to the webinar or in the comments. We're always looking for good topics that are applicable to the folks that we're trying to reach. And one final note, as we go through all this, obviously this is not a substitute for reading the standards themselves. It'll be, definitely a little bit on the higher level side, and there's a lot of detail in these standards, as I'm sure most of you know. So definitely go and, still purchase them and read them when you're doing this testing independently. All right. So now we're really getting into the reason everybody's here, which is the 25 ways to test a syringe. So we're going to go through this kind of looking at working our way through that anatomy of the syringe that Landon described, and then getting to kind of testing the completed system. So we're going to start with the syringe barrel, so really the body of the syringe. Starting at the back, we're going to first talk about flange breakage resistance. So this is the first test that's listed out in ISO 1140-4 and -6. -4 is for testing glass syringes, -6 is for testing plastic syringes. And these two standards are identical in the way they describe this test. This is more typically applicable to glass syringes, but as plastics develop, as Landon hinted at, there's definitely some more hybrid materials that are coming out into the market. This standard may become more applicable for those syringes as well. I would say one of the biggest keys here that we've kind of realized is glass containment. As you can kind of see on the left, this syringe is going to shatter, which is the whole purpose of the test. And so containing both the syringe barrel and the glass breakage of the flange itself are both really important to being able to do this test in a safe way. This standard is certainly becoming more and more relevant as we see more and more auto-injectors on the market. So the flange of the syringe takes a lot of the load that auto-injectors experience during testing. And especially as there's higher viscosity drugs being used in auto-injectors, these flanges need to be able to withstand kind of that back pressure force that they'll experience. Moving now into the barrel of the syringe, we'll talk about glide force testing. So NXE, which is the foundational test for all of kind of the break loose glide force testing that we know is the most common test to perform on syringes. In this case, we're really only looking at the glide force because this is intended to test the lubrication of that syringe barrel with a water-filled syringe. As Landon talked about, this test really is explicitly to look at that lubrication of the barrel. And if there were kind of uneven coating, you would definitely see that on your test curve. So this is an example of that mechanical test revealing something about another attribute of the device. One of the big challenges with this is identifying the beginning and end of that glide force region. I think it's easy to see on this graph where we want to draw those lines, but when it comes to actually identifying that in your data that you've collected, there's several different ways to do it. And it's very much going to be dependent upon the behavior of the syringe and sometimes customer preference for how they would like to select those boundaries. So, it seems to be very simple, but it is something that can be done in a number of different ways within your testing software. Moving now to the front end of the syringe, we'll talk about front end breakage resistance. So this is very similar to NX C1 that we've already talked about. The real key here, I would say, is alignment of that upper probe with the end of the Luer cone itself. So this test, again, it's a simple breakage test. So it's, you're just looking for a peak load, but it is very easy to unintentionally induce a stress concentration elsewhere in the syringe, not right at that Luer cone, which is the part that you're intending to measure. So you'll see in this video that the syringe is going to break right on that front Luer cone, which is exactly what you want to happen. But at that white plastic piece that's clamping the syringe barrel, if that's not sized appropriately or if it's too tight, you can induce failure in the syringe barrel instead, which obviously isn't actually giving you the results that you're interested in. It's also important to note that this probe has kind of that slit so it can test syringes with a staked needle. So again, it's a relatively simple application at appearance, but making sure that your fixturing is designed appropriately to produce the failure in the way that you want is certainly important to being able to get useful results out of this test. So continuing to work our way forward, now we'll talk about the needle. So the first test here is kind of our final structural integrity test. So we've gone through, the back end of the syringe, the barrel of the syringe, the Luer, and now we're looking at the needle. So this test is intending to separate the needle from the Luer cone. The biggest challenge I would say here is actually gripping the needle itself. So we just talked about stress concentrations in the last slide. It's very easy to accidentally induce a stress concentration when you're gripping this very tiny metal tube, which is essentially what a needle is. And it's important to know that, it could be that the needle actually does fail within the length of the needle itself, as opposed to at the bonded hub with the Luer cone. However, you want to make sure that that isn't sort of an artificial result based on the way it's being gripped. And it is actually indicative that the needle is not as strong as the bond. So, in the example here, we're just using a screw side action grip, but that grip does have a lot of kind of flexibility in exactly where you clamp it so that you can do your best to make sure it is perfectly aligned. And making sure then that you're not accidentally putting some sort of undue stress onto the syringe. The last test related to needles is needle penetration test. So again, this is an 1140 test, as most of what we've talked about so far. This is a little bit more of a functional test of the needle, kind of in isolation from the rest of the syringe. 1140 is really an attribute version of this test. It is based on ISO 7864, which is a much more thorough evaluation of needles in general, and specifically Annex D for needle penetration. So 7864 calls out the appropriate membrane to be able to perform this test, and also looks for the peak value and then also the average drag force to retract the needle through the membrane. So 1140 might be appropriate just for doing some comparison testing, or if you kind of just, what the profile should look like as it penetrates the membrane. But to do a more thorough evaluation of needle penetration, 7864 is probably the more thorough standard to use for this. So depending on where you're at in your evaluation process, one or the other is probably the right choice. All right, so now moving to kind of the other type of front end that we see on syringes. So we'll talk all things Luer connector. So the first test here is resistance to separation from axial load. So this obviously comes from ISO 80369, which is kind of the master standard for all things that evaluate a Luer connector. This standard is referenced in a number of other standards in terms of anything to do with evaluation of Luer connectors. There are 4 annexes in this standard that evaluate just the mechanical connection, and then 4 standards that challenge the seal of the connector, basically, and its ability to maintain closure integrity as it passes fluid through it. There's several challenges to testing Luer connectors, and they're pretty common across all of the annexes of this standard. So I'll talk about a number of them here, and then you'll see that it's somewhat consistent across a lot of the different tests. So Luers are manufactured with obviously a very high degree of precision to ensure that that connection stays intact as it's used in practice. So in order to evaluate this appropriately, we need to ensure that there's really high degree of alignment between the reference connector and the syringe under test. If it's at all at an angle or not concentric, you could accidentally induce failure or induce damage on the Luers that is not intentional and would impact your test results. So the fixture that you see here is actually set up on an XY stage with micrometers so that you can finely tune that positioning to ensure that you have really good alignment as you perform this test. The other thing I'll point out is this test is obviously performed on both plastic syringes where the Luer connector is built into the body of the syringe, and also Luer locks that have that rotating collar. So it's important to have a fixture where you can hold that rotating collar in place as you perform the test and as you assemble the connector to ensure that you're not accidentally rotating it and therefore not assembling to the full required torque as dictated by the standard. The next test here is resistance to separation from unscrewing. The last one was resistance to axial load. So all these are just stressing different ways that the Luer connector might experience load kind of when it's actually in use. One thing to point out, so Annex G and a number of these tests are really attribute-only tests where it's just looking to see, does it maintain a certain load for a period of time? Is there visual indication of failure or separation? Annex G is the same way, but Annex I is actually the variable version of this test. So Annex I essentially has you assemble the connector the same way you would for anything, and then has it sit for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you actually do unscrew it fully and see what that peak torque is. This may not really be applicable as much in a pharma setting as it would be for something like an IV line, where you do expect to connect and disconnect that multiple times throughout its use. But it's just worth thinking about whether performing these tests as an attribute test or variable test makes more sense. An attribute test requires more devices to be able to perform. A variable test will require fewer devices, but your system will need to be able to go to higher loads and higher torques in order to actually induce failure in each of these different scenarios. Moving through Annex H, I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly. Basically, you assemble the connector in the same way that we've already discussed, and then you over-torque the threads to look for damage. So the challenges associated with this are largely the same as kind of the annexes that we've already gone through to this point. Now getting into the tests that look at passing fluid through the connector and evaluating basically the seal of that connector. One of the key challenges with this is performing the assembly of the connector and then also doing the pressure evaluations. So, commonly this is done where you assemble it and then you do that pressure test on an independent system. Being able to do it all on one machine, like in the image here, is really advantageous in the sense that everything is in one place. You can do it as a single test procedure, and you save, time and resources and equipment in the sense that you don't need multiple stations to do the testing. You can ensure that, every connector is being torqued and assembled in exactly the same way with that high precision alignment we spoke about. And you're able to complete kind of all of the different pressure annexes as well. Annex C is basically analogous to Annex B as called out by ISO 80369-7. So both of these are used to evaluate the fluid leakage performance requirement. Annex B does it by passing air through the connector, and Annex C does it by passing water through the connector. So as we talked about, to do Annex C, you would have to do your assembly on the system and then remove it and pump water through it on a separate test system. Since the standard says you need to do one or the other to satisfy this requirement, we typically see and typically recommend performing Annex B because they achieve the same, evaluation of the connector, and it's much easier to do this one in sequence with other tests on the same piece of testing equipment. Annex D, I'll also go through kind of quickly. This is basically the inverse of Annex B. So Annex D is applying negative pressure to the connector, while Annex B is applying positive pressure to the connector. Again, being able to do this on a dedicated test system where all of this is just basically a change of your test method and nothing else is a very streamlined and convenient way to be able to perform this testing. The final annex to evaluate the Luer connectors is stress cracking, or Annex E. This annex basically is the same as Annex B or C for the leakage test, either using air or water. However, you perform the assembly and then remove it from the system for 48 hours, let it rest, before reinstalling it and actually performing the evaluation. This is supposed to simulate a real-world condition where if you leave something connected for an extended period of time, does that induce any additional stress on the connector? It's a little bit less relevant for pharma as most medications are delivered in a pretty instantaneous manner and then removed, as opposed to, again, something like an IV line that may stay connected for longer. But it is just, worth mentioning, obviously, and the test procedure itself is the same as either B or C, whichever one has been selected for use. One final note on 80369. So Annex K came out in 2024. So it's something that is new to us and we're still evaluating it. However, like Annex C, where it utilizes water to evaluate leakage in the connector, this would also need to be performed by assembling on the dedicated test system and then removing and testing on an independent system that is able to pump water through it. All right. So now that we've talked through the Luer collar, we're going to now talk about the closure systems of both Luer syringes and stake needle syringes. So the first test here is the Luer lock collar pull-off force test. So we just talked about all the ways to evaluate the connection with that Luer collar. And for all the tests we just went through, we were holding that Luer collar in place while evaluating the connection to ensure that any failure of that collar would not impact the results that we were trying to identify in this case, which was kind of isolating that Luer threaded connection. Now we're going to apply stress to the collar to ensure that it can also kind of withstand the stresses that it would see in the real world. So the goal is basically to ensure that it can withstand the axial load it might experience as it's being mated to a connector in its actual use case. So we would assume that we would want to make sure this collar can withstand at least 35 newtons of load, which is what's applied during the axial separation test in ISO 80369. And one of the keys here, just watching this video, is, the test is performed by pulling off that Luer collar without inducing kind of any compressive or clamping load on it. So we pull it off right from underneath, which ensures that whatever load we're seeing is really just the load that is press fitting that collar onto the tip of the Luer syringe. Now that we've done this, evaluating it axially, we're now going to look at it to evaluate the torque. So in the same way that, we wanted to ensure it can withstand the loads and the torques that it'll see in real world use, we want to make sure that the collar at a very minimum can withstand the 0.1 Newton meters that are applied as you assemble the Luer connector in the ISO 80369 test. Excuse me. Again, we want to grip the Luer collar so that we're not crushing it or imparting any sort of compressive load that could impact the torque that it's able to, the torque at which it rotates, essentially. You'll see that the fixture used here is this 4-jaw lathe with rubber-coated faces. This is intended to ensure that kind of equal load is applied to all sides of that collar, or sorry, of the collar. So again, we're not imparting any load on it. The next test here, the setup looks pretty much identical to the one we just discussed, but this is now for removing the tip cap. So we've now moved past the collar. We're actually looking at the closure system. So this is intended to evaluate, how this tip cap stays in place before the syringe is actually used and ensure that it is sealed so that there is no issues with closure integrity before the syringe is actually used. The setup for this is basically identical to the one we just discussed, but instead of looking obviously at the torque required to rotate the collar, we're looking at the torque to remove the tip cap. And you'll see that quickly in a video here. The fixture that this is being held in on the bottom is something we call a universal syringe fixture, and you've seen it in a lot of these images. This is kind of intended to be the base for the vast majority of the tests performed on a syringe to make this a very easy modular solution so that if you're performing a number of these tests, you don't need a completely different test setup for every single test that you're performing. Now that we've talked about removing tip caps from Luer connections, we'll look at needle shield removal for stake needle syringes. So this is a simple axial pull-off test. And the standard outlines two different ways to do it. And we'll talk about one here and one a little bit later. So one way, and that's what you see in this image, is to essentially kind of hook under the end of the rigid needle shield that's closer to the syringe body and pull it off that way so that you're not applying any sort of side load or clamping load on the actual RNS itself. This utilizes the same fixture that we use to do the collar pull-off test. And again, this just ensures that you're not applying any sort of compressive load to the rigid needle shield. So again, the common fixturing is really advantageous when you're performing a number of these tests. And this is probably the best way to perform this RNS removal whenever possible. Finally, so now that we've looked at removing, the different closure systems, now we're going to actually really stress the closure system to make sure that it can withstand kind of the pressures that it might experience, especially in transit, again, before it's actually used in practice. So, during the discussion of 80369, we discussed leakage of the Luer connectors while they're in use, but this is intended to stress the leakage through that closure system. The mechanism is identical to the way that we perform the glide force testing. So we have an upper probe, we have that lower universal syringe fixture, but instead of seeing that plunger or the stopper rather actually glide through the barrel of the syringe, we're leaving that closure system in place and then visually looking at whether there is any leakage. One of the challenges with this test is really just being able to tune the load control of the system to ensure that we are maintaining the required 110 kPa, which is based on the cross-sectional area of the stopper. So, in Instron's world where we test metals and all sorts of other materials, load control is obviously something that we have familiarity with in that sense, where it basically determines how quickly the system responds to changes in load when it is trying to maintain that load. And so tuning it appropriately to be able to hold that pressure on the stopper of the syringe is really important to be able to perform this test correctly and actually identify the performance of that closure system. All right. So now moving into a few tests that are specifically around plastic syringes. So the first one is looking at the leakage at the syringe plunger. So we've kind of already gone into, we just talked about leakage at the closure system, talked about leakage at the Luer connector. This is kind of the final way to identify a point where there could be leakage in your syringe, specifically in a plastic hypodermic syringe. So the test is performed by applying this kind of aggressive side load to the actual plunger itself. And it instructs you to kind of orient that plunger to induce the maximum deflection, kind of imitating the worst case scenario, essentially. And this is performed on a water-filled syringe. And that upper fixture that you see is actually the same fixture that we'll use on the lower side when we look at this next application of essentially break loose glide force testing for the same hypodermic syringes. So in this test, Annex E, we are looking at effectively the break loose glide force, but specifically dedicated to these types of syringes, which is what ISO 7886 is dedicated to testing. This is a little bit different from the glide force that we talked about earlier, where in this case, we are actually looking at the break loose force in addition to the glide force. And the standard is very explicit in the fixturing that it calls out. So you have to kind of draw fluid through that reservoir, from the reservoir through the tubing, wait for 30 seconds, and then perform your test. So it's very similar to all the other forms of break loose glide force testing that, I think we're all familiar with, but there is this very dedicated set of fixturing that's required for this standard specifically. And similar to what we talked about with glide force, identifying the start and end of that glide force region is, again, sort of a common challenge with all of these break loose glide force tests. All right. So now that we've gone through kind of all the different subcomponents of a syringe, the subassembly evaluations of a syringe. Now we can kind of talk about the essential outputs, right? So now that we've filled this, it's a finished product. What are the essential, performance requirements or EPRs that we care about? Now the language that is being used in the FDA guidance is EDDOs, or essential drug delivery outputs, but that and essential performance requirements is probably the more common language, but they are really the same thing. So the first one here is burst resistance. So this is called out by ISO 1140-8, which is very similar to ISO 1140-4 and -6 for testing the subassembly of glass syringes, plastic syringes. Now this looks at finished syringes. It references back to 1140-4 and 6 quite a lot, but there are a handful of tests that are unique to testing the finished syringe as opposed to testing the subcomponents of the syringe. So this test in particular is basically identical to the G2 leakage test that we just talked about. The setup is the same. The test method is almost identical, except now we're actually testing to failure instead of just testing to hold that pressure for a set period of time. The fixturing is the same also as what we use for the glide force testing. So it's, again, a common setup, but 3 different kind of types of evaluations that you might use it to perform. And this is a case where it would be done on that finished prefilled syringe. The next test is, again, actually is identical to the test that we perform in 1140-4 and -6, where we're removing that needle shield from the syringe. We talked earlier about on a prefilled syringe, how we recommend doing it, pulling up on that needle cap, on that rigid needle shield without clamping on the sides. The other way that the standard calls out doing it is by clamping on it and trying to avoid imparting as much, deformation or damage to the cap as possible. For testing something like a safety syringe, which is basically a prefilled glass syringe with a plastic housing around it that acts as a passive needle guard or passive sharps protection, as Landon talked about at the beginning of the presentation. It basically is a prefilled syringe. It just has the safety mechanism built into it. And as a result, the plastic housing doesn't really allow you to come and, pull off that rigid needle shield, starting at the part closest to the syringe body in the way that you would on either a subassembly or on a prefilled syringe. So in that case, we do need to grab it from the sides. And, the intent is obviously to reduce as much damage as possible or any deformation of the syringe. So, it's also one of the challenges with testing safety syringes that we'll see kind of on the upcoming slides is, we often try to evaluate these where we can test for all of the EDDOs in sequence. So typically cap removal is performed in succession with the rest of the essential outputs, similar to the way that you might be testing an auto-injector. So now we're looking at 1140-8 for break loose and extrusion forces. So this is our third version of break loose glide force testing that we've talked about. So again, this also refers directly to 1140-4 Annex E, where we just look at glide force. But in this case, we do actually care about break loose force as well, because break loose force is obviously what a patient would experience in order to begin the initiation of that plunger movement. And then we do still want to know what's the average glide force over the course of the syringe barrel once it's actually filled with drug product. Again, the image that you see here is in testing a safety syringe where we've already done our cap removal, and then we would be performing break loose glide in sequence to be able to capture all of the other EDDOs of a device like this. Next is sharps injury protection. So this test is again part of 1140-8, but it refers directly to ISO 23908, which is the entire standard that is dedicated to sharps protection. This doesn't refer back to anything that you might find in -4 or -6 because it's obviously part of the finished product as opposed to part of the subassembly that those two standards are focused on. The standard calls out the two types of mechanism that Landon mentioned. So passive, which is what the safety syringe utilizes, where the needle shield locks into place after activation and requires no manual intervention to engage it. It's just that you have to achieve a certain amount of applied load to the syringe, so in order to activate the mechanism. So typically it's around 20 newtons. You do your complete break loose glide force test, the stopper hits the end of the syringe barrel, and that achieves enough load to activate the safety mechanism. This is, again, typically performed in sequence with the rest of the test, the same way you might test an auto-injector, so that you're able to capture all those critical results for a single syringe in a single test. Typically, you'll either go to a quick lockout check of a load that you know is beyond, is a load that you know the needle shield needs to be able to withstand, or you might go to a defeat force where you're trying to override that lockout mechanism and understand at what load it might fail. The final piece here is deliverable volume. So this is also called out in 1140-8, and similarly is a requirement that is only for kind of these finished prefilled syringes. Essentially what all this calls out is we want to know that the dose inside the syringe, whether it's prefilled syringe or safety syringe, is the intended dose to be delivered to the patient. We typically capture this by injecting directly onto a scale so that you can immediately capture what that delivered volume is, or capture the delivered mass, convert it to volume using the fluid density, and report it in the same report where you're also reporting out the cap removal force, the break loose and glide force, and then also your lockout check. So the system that you see here is dedicated for testing auto-injectors, but testing prefilled syringes or testing safety syringes on a very similar setup where you're able to kind of capture multiple of these critical tests in a single specimen, dramatically reduces time for testing, reduces the number of specimens you need for testing, and just kind of streamlines that whole test process. And finally, we're at 25 of 25. This one's a little bit of a bonus and definitely is more than one test, but had to be mentioned, I think, in the context of the rest of the tests that we've gone through. To this point, we've really just talked about syringes themselves in different form factors and the evaluation of different aspects of the syringe. But this standard for 11608 is obviously for testing auto-injectors themselves, into which a lot of these prefilled glass syringes go. So, all of this testing very much goes hand in hand in the sense that depending on where you are in the development of a drug product, you might be evaluating the subassemblies of a syringe, or, you might be testing the complete finished auto-injector as well. And what you learn at each kind of stage of that testing may inform decisions up and down your development process. Typically for testing an auto-injector, as we've kind of talked about in the context of safety syringes, we typically recommend testing all these things in sequence because to do your cap removal force, your activation force, click detection, all the injection monitoring on independent test equipment takes up way more time and resources, lab space, and is much harder to consolidate all your data when you really want all of those EDDOs for one device to be contained in a single report. And this finally is just kind of the long list of everything we just went through. Our goal with this was really not to just rattle off names of standards, but to emphasize what we're testing, how all these standards interface and overlap with each other. And again, each of these could really be their own separate webinar. So, if there is a topic that you want us to dive deeper on, please let us know because we're certainly open to that. But hopefully this provided kind of a good overview of all the different ways that you might evaluate a syringe, with some insights scattered throughout there. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Nick and we will take a look at any of the questions that might have come in.
All right, great job, both of you. And we have time for questions. So welcome back, Landon. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions that we have here, and I'll let whoever makes the most sense to or wants to raise their hand to answer. So first being, I am interested in the configuration and parameterization of the system for combined rotational and axial pull-off motion at prefilled syringe with screw cap, referencing ISO 11040-6 Annex G5. Who wants it?
I mean, I can certainly take it. I mean, I think Meredith touched on that standard in particular. So it's one of the two sections of ISO 1140 that do require biaxial capability. So the ability to rotate in addition to perform axial. And kind of as she went through, we use the same base fixture to hold on to the barrel, and then use a lathe chuck to do the actual removal of the tip cap. And it's a relatively straightforward test in that you are doing a simple 90-degree rotation and reporting out a peak torque. So from a test complexity, it's relatively straightforward. It does require probably more of the actual system capability compared to some of the other tests.
All right, thank you for that. Next question. Do you see a trend of a greater demand for testing of one syringe device over the others?
I can take that one. So I would say especially on the prefilled syringe side of things, aside from safety syringes, they are all essentially uniform in their form factor, geometry. I mean, in fact, they actually take their geometric kind of design envelope from ISO 1140-4. So from Instron, from a testing perspective, there isn't really any difference between one manufacturer or another. So whether it was BD, Gerresheimer, Schott, Stevanato, whoever is the syringe manufacturer, whoever is supplying the actual subcomponents within the syringe, the testing is going to be relatively identical. Is not going to necessarily change our approach for performing the testing. The other side of it is safety syringes, which are somewhat more similar to auto-injectors in that they are often more tailored in their geometry to the patient or to the actual indication that's being treated. So you do have different levels of customization for different types of safety syringes that could affect how we perform the test. There are certainly some platform devices for safety syringes that are much more common. I think in general, more pharmaceutical companies are leaning into well-established platform products that have kind of a healthy string of commercializations under their belt. There's typically more hesitancy and kind of a shying away from the risk that can be associated with newer safety syringe platforms that are not necessarily quite as proven.
All right. And then I'm seeing one more question, unless somebody else dropped something in there while we're talking here. But what is your position on leak testing that simultaneously challenges the plunger and needle ends of the syringe?
I mean, I think that essentially would be the burst resistance or the closure system leakage test. In either of those tests, we are not specifically isolating either end of the syringe. We're looking for whatever kind of is the leading failure mode of the syringe closure. So I think there are certainly annexes that are specifically looking at the closure performance of the individual elastomeric component. And then I think these two tests look at the entire system kind of in a complete state. And this testing, I guess I don't have a specific position other than that. It essentially is kind of covered by either of these different annexes of ISO 1140. And is typically probably a more realistic real world application to understand what might actually fail first.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our Q&A section. So thank you, thank both of you for presenting. That was a fantastic presentation. Excellent job cramming 5 extra test methods into our library of webinar content around syringe testing. Before I wrap things up, I'm going to have a few quick notes here. If any additional questions come in, we'll follow up with you via email. And again, a copy of today's recording will be sent to you by email. We'll also share the slide deck. And then for more resources, including the latest on ASTM and ISO testing standards and information on our full range of solutions for testing medical and pharmaceutical devices, be sure to visit our website. I've dropped a link into the chat where you can get started. And then finally, a short survey will appear once this webinar ends. We'd really appreciate if you could take a few moments to share your feedback. It helps us improve and shape our future sessions. So with that, thanks again for the presentation here. And thanks to all of you for spending some time with us. Take care, and we hope to see you again at a future webinar.